All right, everyone, thank you for joining us today. Again, sorry about the technical difficulties. My name is Dina Stevens. I am the Executive Director of the Federation of Ontario Public Libraries. We have with us today guest speaker, Dr. Sabrina Redwing Saunders, who is or was on the FOPL board and part of the Indigenous Libraries Partnership Working Group. And through the working group, Sabrina will be talking about furthering truth and reconciliation in your libraries, using a document that our working group published earlier this year in April, which has very practical and applicable solutions to applying truth and reconciliation in your own libraries, so that way you too can follow with what FOPL is doing for the 94 calls to action as well. I'll turn it over to Sabrina now, and I'll let her take you through.
Thank you. Again, sorry for the Zoom link issues. It's always fun getting into Zoom sometimes here. So I just wanted to start by saying I am Sabrina Saunders. I am Delaware, which is Lani Lenape, and Mohawk from Grand River Territory. I work in the Blue Mountains Public Library, and that is in Anishinaabe area, which is the Treaty 18 area region of 1818. So I just wanted to give acknowledgement to where I am presenting from, and it certainly ties directly into what we're trying to talk about here with truth and reconciliation in our public libraries. I'm going to have Dina. Oh, I'm seeing a screen, Dina. There we go. If you can just go to the next slide. So the 94 calls to action is something that I hope that everybody is familiar with, at least in concept. There is a great little red book that's about 4 inches, 3.5 inches by 3.5 inches. I have it in my library. We gave it out to people when the ministries were sort of giving these away for free, getting ready for the first Truth and Reconciliation Day last year. But it's important that you know that this is what came out of the major study, that there are 6 areas and that there are 94 calls to action, and they are across all areas. So it should be pervasive through government. If we look at the calls to action, they really don't feel like they fit for us, because as we call on the federal government too, we fall on provincial governments too, we call on municipal governments too. So what we're trying to do here today is to bring this into a realm that makes sense for what we can do in our public libraries, what we can do as the advocates in our community, and really kickstart this across other areas. And for those of you that are working in a municipality or a county that's feeling like by acknowledging anything, calls to action, having a land acknowledgement, somehow it's bringing up the treaty matter that might be a land claim. That's what we want to try to get across is how do we do this, and how do we start moving things forward? So next slide. FOPL has put together this document in both English and French for those that are our Francophone libraries. And we have a 13-part point work plan for what we're accomplishing in 22 and 23. And then there are 10 calls to action that we think are really specific to library members. So next slide. I'm not going to go through the ones that we have, but you can see that there's pieces that we are looking at here. We've made our own acknowledgement statement, and it's how we will open general meetings. I opened a bit different because I'm elsewhere. How are we engaging our First Nation public libraries? How are our First Nation public libraries partnering with our provincial libraries and making sure that we can move these pieces forward? Next slide. So these are those sort of pieces there. And how did we really try to engage with not just us, but what's happening nationally? NICLA, if you're not familiar, is the National Indigenous Knowledge and Language Alliance. It's only about 2.5, 3 years old, but being an active member of NICLA is meaning that we have direct connection with what's happening in libraries, what's happening in museums, and that's a really key piece of what we're trying to accomplish with FOPL. And of course, CFLA, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee report, that was done a number of years ago and is sort of the kickoff cornerstone for what people had done. But it was looking at what CFLA should do, kind of like these first two slides, and not what member libraries can do. So I don't want to touch too much on those, especially since we lost about 10 minutes, but we're going to dive into these 10 activities that we think that you can do. So next slide. All right, so this is kind of an important slogan, and I think that it's not just what we can do, but it's what we must do. We're talking about truth and reconciliation. We can't have reconciliation without truth. They really build on each other. So our public libraries, we know, fight to do one major piece, and that is about providing the resources that are real, that are relevant, that are vetted. And that's why I think that when we look at all of these calls to action, our public libraries really should be the home base, that it seeds in a way that our municipalities can kind of piggyback off of. So let's jump into these calls to action. Next slide. So first one, and all of these slides are going to look like this. So call to action number 10. And again, remember there were 94, they were across 6 different areas. When we read them, you look at it and you go, this has nothing to do with me. So we call on the federal government, not our public libraries, to draft new Aboriginal education legislation. So they're trying to make sure that the authors of the Truth and Reconciliation Report, that Indigenous people see Indigenous people in content, that the education has impact, that there is culturally appropriate curricula. And we say none of that belongs to us. But when we look at it deeper, we can say, and that's why we look to the sort of boxes in the corner, what can our member libraries do? If you support local community education with the resources and curriculum materials that you can have in your library, you are supporting this action. You are not going to be able to move the federal government. You are certainly not going to be able to move the legislation, but we can say, great, we know what the spirit of this action is, and we can do that by purchasing our materials. Making sure that our materials are vetted is important. When you just buy something on Amazon, you don't really know where it came from. So working with Indigenous authors, working with Indigenous publishers, working with the jobbers that sell specifically Indigenous materials that are really vetting it and working with them is a plus. All right, so that is one down. And what you're going to find, you can go to the next slide. What you're going to find is that a lot of these begin to repeat. So although we're saying that there are 10 action items that you can do, there's going to be a few pieces, and some of them are going to keep sort of repeating themselves. So action number 13, again, we call upon the federal government to acknowledge that Aboriginal rights include Aboriginal language rights. So for us to be able to say that we have multi-language collections, that right there is supporting that action. So that means you have to do some research. Who is your territory? Are you lucky enough that you have a reserve in close proximity that you can say, I would love to have materials in my collection. I would love not just to have the language materials that are a dictionary, which is sort of the perfunctory level of content, but I would like to have items that have been translated. I know when I worked at Six Nations Public Library, we worked with a local group that was doing translation. And I brought in those, the thin little books that you can get from Scholastic that are, A is for apple, B is for whatever. And I got SpongeBob books and we translated them. They kept the book and they just put what it was in Mohawk underneath. And, the kidlets would take it out and love it. But I found that even adults were taking it out because they wanted that multi-language collection, that opportunity to see their own language in modern materials. Another piece on Action 13, of course, is the support community entities to provide Indigenous language programs on site. So I have a rental policy that gives me the opportunity to say that I will work with community partners to give them access to our space. In other words, free rentals. So if you have somebody who's doing an Indigenous language program, don't just ask them for the materials, but say, come on in and do stuff. I am not a language speaker. I did not grow up in community, but what I could do when I was a librarian was to say, I'm going to have Tuesday night conversation nights, and it is sort of potluck. I provide the room, and intergenerational meeting spaces can be there, and they're going to speak in the language of the local region. It's a way of bringing it again back in with sort of a natural fit. All right, let's move on to the next action item. So number 14, we call upon the federal government to enact an Aboriginal Languages Act. So looking at all of the pieces in there again, pull out how can we be involved? Again, provide those multi-language collections. Again, provide those spaces for people to be able to do it. But then a third one that we can add on to this one is looking at UNDRIP. So provide information to the community on UNDRIP, and that's the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So provide the information on that and the treaties with a focus on local communities. So again, make sure that you're getting your collections, make sure you have access to local content about community members. And in your website, in your resources, in your electronic documents that you're making available, connect to UNDRIP, connect to the treaty that is specific to your community. People may be interested in seeing what those pieces are. So next item. Action number 43. So we call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and municipal governments to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples as the framework for reconciliation. So UNDRIP is one of those pieces when I work with my municipality that it's not us. It's too big. It's international. That's not what we need to be focusing on. When I work with my municipalities, however you want to call it, EDI, we have IDEA, which is the inclusion, and it adds an access onto the typical DEI programs. They're looking at what they can do. So again, we're going to have those best practices in our programming there, but we're also going to support our municipality to start to fracture that thinking of, oh, this is too big for us. We'll raise a flag one day out of the year and we'll all stand together and we say we're supporting, but we're not actually making action. So working with those municipal committees is a way of doing that, to bring in those best practices. Another one, and I have some tips sort of at the end if we have time that I'll talk about, is to adopt an acknowledgement statement. I'm still surprised at how many libraries, but also municipalities do not have an acknowledgement statement. And what I'm hearing from people lately is it's perfunctory. It's just, we read it like the emergency exit alarms will go off, and we have a 2-stage fire alarm. And if you raise your hand, a member of the staff will help you exit. If that's what's happening in your community, then you have to stop and you have to start to look at that and find ways to make it a teaching moment. And hopefully, like I said, we have some time at the end to hit that. Next slide. So number 57, we call upon the federal, provincial, territorial, and again, municipal governments to provide education to public servants on the history of Aboriginal peoples, including the history of UNDRIP, our legacy of residential schools, treaty rights, all of these pieces, again, really big stuff. But the municipality is in there. Your county is in there if that's the tier that you're in for your level. If we train staff on reconciliation activities, these types of pieces, but then also dig in the awareness and the knowledge, that's something that is going to bring these types of pieces together. So we can't wait for the municipality or the province to say we're going to do these things. We have to do them on our own levels. And we have to start internally with our staff, and then we have to try to fracture into our municipalities and into our counties, because we know that the librarians are embracing this, but it's not always happening in our local government there. And then the other piece is that we are going to provide specialized training to our staff pertaining to Indigenous library services. And I know I was the president of OLA last year, and I had the opportunity to give the President's Award. And that award was given to our Indigenous librarians, our First Nation library CEOs working on reserve, because they're under such attack, especially after COVID, that I wanted to make sure that this room full of people, this 1,000 people that were in the room, and another 1,000 that were at home, or 2,000 at home watching, had the opportunity to really think about the numbers, how they were being funded, how they were not being funded. We talk about having, tax-based revenues in our public library system, and that's not present, nor is there a way to do that. So those libraries are really struggling just to be able to keep the doors open. And when I started working as a librarian in 2007, there were 54 First Nation public libraries. When I made my presentation, there were 39 public libraries, and that was just in January this year. We're now down to 34, I believe. We've lost more just in this year. So providing the specialized training to staff about Indigenous library services, about our public librarians, and also the Indigenous library services for what our Indigenous community members might be looking for. Next action, please. So 63, we call upon the Council of Ministers of Education of Canada to maintain an annual commitment to Aboriginal education issues. So again, this is far-reaching, well outside of our mandate, but how we can fit in is where it begins. So provide accurate collections is the most important thing that we can do. Look at your Indigenous collections. Is it, in an Indigenous collection together? Is it embedded? That really doesn't matter. It's how you work best in your organization. But make sure that you don't have any of those old dusty books. Make sure that you have materials that are coming in with new stories. So that's how you can make sure that curriculum is available in that way. It's not really curriculum from our end. It's what people want to do for self-learning, but also what students need to be able to do their reports. And then provide programs that support for that intercultural understanding, empathy, mutual respect, and an understanding of the historical issues. That's a tough one. People are scared to invite in a presenter who's going to really hit issues and make people think. But there are a number of people out there who are willing to come into our libraries and do it. You want to talk about another area. It's not easy having a drag story time, but you know what? We're doing it because it's what we need to do to break down barriers and to support an entire new generation of Canadians to have a better understanding. So we're doing that. Let's look at the other side, and let's try to do some hard decisions on the type of programs we have that are bringing in that truth and reconciliation piece. And then, of course, the curriculum supports. Some schools will say we don't do curriculums. I'm not asking you to, purchase the grade 10 Indigenous book from the province at this point, but look to see what your local schools, what your local students are needing to be able to have that type of material on site, from both the information levels in our nonfiction, as well as our, picture books, up to, great literature that is out there from our Indigenous members. Next slide. Number 67, we call upon the federal government to provide funding to the Canadian Museums Association. So I'm not sure about you. I am a GLAM, so that is a gallery, library, archives, and museum. So I actually have a museum that I am responsible for. I know that's not the norm, but there are quite a number of libraries who have partnerships with museums. So we should be looking at our own local history collection and any work that we're doing outside within that GLAM area to make sure that we have our practices and we're looking at that Indigenous content. One of the things that the Ontario Public Library Guidelines did recently is it added a line in their local history policy, the collection policy piece, that talks about saying that we acknowledge that our local history was written by, whoever was the local people in that community, which is, sorry, white, very much a perspective. It is not going to be, white Christian is typical. It's not going to be looking at the Indigenous content. It's sort of touched on. So acknowledging that in your local history policy, that it's a piece that you want to try to build on to decolonize what you have in your collection. Doesn't mean you're throwing out your collection, doesn't mean your local history is invalid. It just means you are acknowledging a gap. And that's something that our museum associations are really working to acknowledge in all of these collections that they have, as well as if you're lucky enough to be in an area where there are artifacts or some type of communities that were there, that you're acknowledging that it's not just a historic people, it's the past of people who are existing today and knowing where these communities are. All right, on to our next one, which is 77. We call upon the provincial, territorial, again, our municipal, and community archives to work collaboratively with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation to identify and collect copies of all relevant records, and it goes on. The odds are that a public library does not have that type of piece, but often our public libraries are aware of where materials are, they're aware of connections that could be made, and there is absolutely nothing wrong with reaching out to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation if you feel that you have any type of materials. But outside of that, making sure that you are looking at your local community histories, that you are offering programs where people can come together and have conversations about this. If there certainly is a school near you, then our public libraries should be connecting with whoever is maintaining that site. And we all know it's not schools, they're institutions. But if there was an institution in your area, it's not your job to have to collect and report, but it is your job to have to make sure that you have connections and how you, as a provider of truth, can be working with to get that type of information out. I know people had, quite the activity when we had 215 graves that we were looking at. We're looking at thousands at this point that have been found, and it's not getting the same fanfare, for a better word. So it's an opportunity for your library to know what is happening and be able to put that information out. All right, next one is number 80. So we call upon the federal government in collaboration with Aboriginal peoples to establish a statutory holiday. So that has been achieved. I'll say it's the only one that has actually been achieved at this point. Federally, I know our province has not accepted it as a day. It falls on a Saturday this year, so you may or may not be having programs, but put the flag up. If you don't have the flag, most certainly put the flag up. Wear your orange shirts. We purchase shirts for our library to make sure that all of our staff who are going to be there certainly have the opportunity to wear an orange shirt. Do programming. You may not be able to get programming on the 30th. each year, there's so many Indigenous people who are doing presentations, and we're all being called on the same day. So there's nothing wrong with saying we're doing our Truth and Reconciliation program on Thursday, because that's when we have the ability to bring a person in, and then make sure your social media is reminding people of the good work that you did at that point. So certainly commemorating, celebrating, having our programs. We just are so good at doing these types of programs. But also remember that it isn't just one day out of the year. We want to make sure we're doing programs like this throughout. Our next one, I think this might be our last. Yes. So number 93, we call upon the federal government in collaboration with the National Aboriginal Organizations to revise the information kit for newcomers to Canada and its citizenship test to reflect a more inclusive history of diverse Aboriginal peoples. I know that this is something that was worked on. My husband actually became a citizen in November last year, and he was quite surprised with some of the content that's in there. There's always more strides to be made. But we know that when we are welcoming our newcomers, each community is going to be different. If you have a newcomer program, include information about the Indigenous people who were from that area and are still in that area. If there's a history of change over periods, these are things that we know most of our newcomers are really interested in. So having that as part of your resources that you can promote out to newcomers to Canada is certainly something that we could do well. All right, next we have sort of my wrap up, which is the overriding truth and reconciliation strategy. So I kind of have 4 things that I'm looking at myself and helping others who have asked for some tips on what's happening in their library. I don't care what you call them, DEI, EDI, IDEA, it's all the same thing. It's all the same concepts, but make sure that it is supporting truth and reconciliation and it's not replacing it. So we don't want to have that say, because we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we don't need to specifically call out truth and reconciliation because it's part of that. It is part of that, but it needs to stand alone. It needs to be called out on its own to say, we are doing this because we believe that reconciliation is important. We believe the truth is something that needs to be maintained. And that is what one of our jobs are. We are the people who tell you where the facts are. So I think that that's important. Make sure you have a strong DEI committee and group, but don't let it try to gobble up the truth and reconciliation piece. Second, truth and reconciliation has to be in your strategic plan. It has to be in your action plans. It has to be in your work plans. It can't just be a September 30th or one day here or there programs. So really try to see how it embeds your thinking, looking at policy, looking at your local history collection. Do you have an acknowledgement statement? All of those types of pieces. It needs to be pervasive in that plan. And that means working with our board members to make sure that our board members understand what it is that we are doing and why we believe in these actions. The third is to look at actions and collections through a truth and reconciliation lens. So when we're looking at our collections, that's a little bit easier. But when we're trying to think of our actions, remember what it is you're trying to accomplish, and then make sure that the action and the consultation or the people that you are speaking to are meeting that. It isn't just a case of I am going to hire somebody in and give them a cost, and now I've done my bit. Yes, you've helped your community, but what are you doing in that aspect of truth and reconciliation? How are you learning about your community as well? So make sure that it isn't just that you're signing a check or an invoice and therefore you've accomplished it for the library, that it is your staff as well that are involved in that lens of thinking and acting. And then number 4 is kind of the no-brainer. We have to operationalize truth and reconciliation. There's a lot of concepts, but this is what we want to do next, is say, we're going to do these 10 things. When you're looking at your library, there's sort of like the 3 areas. There's the easies. I can do these today. I can do these with no effort. I can do these with no money. I can do these without having to get permission from the board. Then there's more work, a little bit more activity, maybe a little bit of money, maybe there's some political impact that I need to get through. And then there's those sort of final third step ones, which are, it's a major shift for an organization. It's going to take work. It's going to take time. It's going to take money. You're going to have to change the perspective in your municipality. So always when you're operationalizing, hit the easy ones. Get them in because you start making an impact. And again, you're starting to fracture in areas where those walls are. So start with your easies, move into the more difficults, more politicals, and then eventually you'll be able to work into those more difficult ones that take more activity. Next slide. All right. So I have this one up, and I used this at a previous presentation that I did. I've had so many people say to me that, well, truth and reconciliation is really hard. And how are we going to change people's minds, especially change people's minds, maybe who are generationally older than me, and it's just the way they were taught. Think back 25 years, if hopefully some of you are my age and you can think back at least that. What was happening? People were smoking. You were smoking in airplanes. You were smoking in libraries. We don't do that anymore, right? Recycling. If I was to go to my grandparents and talk about recycling, these were people that when they changed their oil, they weren't opposed to letting the oil go down into the sewer line. Like these were days that it was the Wild West, we can say, of those. But we've made those changes. We know it's in our best interest to recycle. We know it's in our best interest of health not to smoke. These are things that we shifted in a point of view. So if we look at reconciliation in the same way, it's in our best interest. We just have to shift that point of view. So we start thinking differently. All right, we are coming up on our last slide. The acknowledgement statement. So this was talked about a few different times in our action items. I have 5 things that I ask people to think about when they do an acknowledgement statement. And I know that many people did this 5 years ago. And then it opens up your meeting and you kind of rattle it off and you hope you get the names right. And then we go on to the passing of the agenda or a moment of silence. I ask you to say, what is our intention? Is our intention to actually acknowledge the people, the land, the soil, the vegetation, the waters that are here? Or is it that we just have to get through this so that we can get into the meat of the meeting? If your intention is to do the first, then stop and let that hit home on what you're doing. Rotate that around so it's not the same person. It's not always the chair. It's not always the secretary of the board or the CEO. If it's in a program, there's nothing wrong with giving your acknowledgement statement and then giving an explanation of what you are saying in there and why, so people are learning out of that. The next one is do your homework. If we don't know the history, we certainly can't do an acknowledgement statement. We need to know who is there, what treaty it is, who is there now, what are the people that have come and gone. So do your homework, learn your history. You don't have to reach out to the local reserve to get that. You can do those things on your own. The reading of the land acknowledgement is a teach-in. So yeah, I come from a family that was a bunch of hippies in the 70s. So most definitely that concept of teach-in is something I understand. And I see the land acknowledgement as our opportunity to teach people what we're saying and take that moment before a meeting or take that moment before a program or a board meeting. And then fourth, I'm seeing a lot of the acknowledgement statements that start talking about the land, the people, but then it starts talking about them, their library, their responsibilities. It's okay to give some aspect of what your responsibilities are as saying, we believe this, but try to think back. What's your intention? Again, is it about you or is it about what you're trying to put forward? And then number 5 is a big one still. A library is an independent and autonomous body from council. So if your council is telling you you cannot have an acknowledgement statement because there's a land claim or there's some political opinion, you need to do some work there. First of all, you are independent, you are autonomous, so you can do that. You don't need their permission. We also have to acknowledge, though, that they give the bulk of your funding. So how are you going to make that work? So that is a conversation, though, if you're having, and there are many people who have already passed that, so you don't have to fight it on your own. There are libraries who were told early on no, and now even their municipalities or counties are starting to do that. All right, so I think we are kind of back on time there. Is there any questions that people have that we can kind of talk through them? If you want to take the slides down, maybe we can see faces. Oh, we got to put those screens on. Where are those cameras? There we go. People are coming in. David.
Hello, Sabrina. Thank you so much for this amazing conversation. My name is David Quesada. I work at Burlington Public Library. I'm one of the new EDI managers, so Equity, Diversity, Inclusion managers. My question is regarding the stand of the library's role in the community, specifically because we are talking about the Indigenous community. So we know that when we talk about truth and reconciliation, we need to provide the resources to talk about the truth. But the reconciliation piece maybe is missing from the role of the library. So I've been in conversations with Indigenous community, and myself I'm Indigenous, but not from North America. My father is from the South American Mapuche people. And I think the key is build that relationship again. So how we as libraries can build that relationship that is missing based on the truth and the situation that happened here in Canada, in Southern Island.
When we have our cities, I think it's a lot easier in our city situations because there are a number of friendship centers that are always having community meetings, community forums. They might have a Indigenous council that is looking for partners to be able to sit and work with them. So that's an opportunity that the public library could sit at one of those tables where you're going to them saying, tell me what you need of me, as opposed to trying to do something and pull information out of them. They will give you the stuff that they think the community needs, and you'll be part of that reconciliation process simply by being at the table and being a partner, an ally, and a key player. I prefer, instead of being an ally, to be an agitator. I like to make things happen as opposed to just saying, I stand, right? So anytime that somebody asks me to be an ally, I'm like, well, I'll join you, but I'll be an agitator, or other words that maybe we shouldn't say here. But yes, let's all be there to do the good fight. So David, I would say, look for the committees that are happening in Burlington. And there are areas that are in Burlington or close to Burlington, and say, let us be a partner, and they will give you marching orders on some things that they want help with and they want to have a joint effort on. Beverly.
Okay, I have a follow-up question to David, then I have my own. Just because we're both in Halton region, and there is not a friendship center. We have groups that work, and we do work with them, groups that work independently from the treaty holders, but they don't necessarily, their views don't necessarily align with those of the treaty holders. So any suggestions there? I mean, we're just sort of working through it, right? We just keep going ahead and we try and be nice, but I'm just curious. And then I'll ask my other question.
There are definitely many groups, all with individual agendas. Even, take the Indigenous compound out of that, and it's already there in all of ours. So yeah, I think that you need to look to see what are the mandates that people have, and where do you think you align best? So there's going to be times where you say, I will sit at various tables, we will work with certain people, but we know the group B certainly fits the mandate of the way we need to do our programs and our actions, and where we think we can make the most impact. So there's nothing wrong with saying, you know, we are supporting all, we believe in all, but this group actually sort of, we walk in the same direction. So it's a hard thing, but you know, we all have to figure out where our bestest of friends can be and where we can make the most of situations that benefit both.
Okay, thank you. Actually, that does help.
Don't feel guilty. We have to pick and choose every day. It's the fact that we're thinking about it and we're doing something and not just saying, too hard to think about.
I think it goes back to your idea of intentions and what's the intention, and our intention is right. The larger impact, and versus the municipality's role, which is the council to council and governance to governance relationship.
Correct.
This is a very specific question on land acknowledgements. We were just reviewing our land acknowledgements and most recently, and I have been informed that our treaty holders, Mississaugas of the Credit, prefer us, and I think it's a general statement that was given to me by our cultural services manager who heads up this portfolio for the town. But the reflection on the concept of adding a reflection, right, and that educational component into it is something that is preferred by urban Indigenous people and less for treaty holders. So I'm just curious how to marry that in what we're doing as libraries.
You know, and it's really specific. I'd have to see sort of what the language is. I think, again, intention is number one. And then number two is, don't make it about us. If you need to, like the library, if you need to put something in that you think is bringing people back into sort of the fold of what you're trying to accomplish, and that's where sort of that intention and that piece that you're trying to add at the end is, then that makes sense. I'd be happy to take a look at what you have and just give feedback. Yeah.
On the subject of land acknowledgements, there is a couple messages in the chat. So there was a message that asks, can you please speak to usage of the land acknowledgement? Overuse. So do you feel that there's overuse of the land acknowledgement?
I hate to keep using the word perfunctory because it is something that is a tough one. Land acknowledgements are, you can hear it in the voice. Sometimes people are just like rattling it off, and then they tell you about the, you know, emergency exits, and then they say, and can I have a mover of the agenda? And it just feels like, oh, you know, the chair has entered the building and now we're going to read it this way. If that's what's happening, I think that you've lost the intention. So at that point, it's on all of us to call it out. If you're in a meeting, you can go after the meeting and talk to someone and say, you know, I think maybe we need to change this around so that different people are reading it, so we can try to bring that back. Also, that question of, do we do it every single time we gather? I think you need to figure out what are the times that it makes the most sense, so that you are, again, hitting that intention. If you're doing a program and you have the members of the public coming, I think it's important. If you're having the finance committee that is meeting in the back room, that we do this every 2 weeks, probably isn't something that needs to be in there. And if you feel that you want to just sort of shake it up once in a while, you could say, hey, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement for this, and do a short thing that reminds people that there's reasons why we do all of this. We're here for bigger reasons than just making sure our books are balancing. But yeah, I think that it needs to have an intention of what it is we want to achieve, and that will answer the question of whether or not you should be doing it at a meeting.
Janet, did that answer your question? Or do we
I
have
hope that answers whoever wrote that in.
It was Janet, so that's why I was asking if that satisfied her question. Another question from the chat. Katie Scarlett asks, I was wondering if you have a program that is a 6-week series. I've had pushback about doing it at the start of each one. So about a land acknowledgement at the start of each program of a 6-week series or program. It looks like Katie Scarlett's had some pushback because she was doing a land acknowledgement at the start of each of the program of the 6-week series.
Yeah, no, I can see that. Again, if people feel like you're just doing it because we have to do this every time and you lose that intention. But in that case, Katie Scarlett, I would say if you do it at the first one, you can be at your second one and say, we're not going to do a land acknowledgement since we've already opened our meeting last week, and then move on. In saying that, you're actually bringing it back to their mind without reading the 3 paragraphs. Because then you're saying our series is actually a gathering that we started last week and we're going to keep going. So you just sort of making a nod to it in that way.
Hallie asks, do you have any advice on how to do an acknowledgement statement with children?
That's a good one. There was a program that we tried putting through with the federal government, about 2005. And one of the pieces we wanted to look at was having the provincial government look at various forms of education and curriculum. And we wanted kindergarten to talk about a promise. Everybody who is 4 and 5 years old knows what a promise is. And they know that when mom says you were going to do something and then you don't get to do it, that mom has broken that promise. And then you know about it, right? They let you know. Kids are very, very honest. What is a promise? A promise is a treaty. It's something that you've made. So we wanted to bring the concept of truth right down into the curriculum at every level that they could build on from kindergarten through grade 12. So I completely think that you could do a land acknowledgement with your young children. When you get into grade 3, the curriculum is talking about, regions and weather and what you wear in different places. Well, who are the people that lived there at one point and who are the people that live there now? That's a land acknowledgement, right? It doesn't have to be something that you do just at the beginning of a meeting. It's how you bring it in to the conversation. So yeah, I think that it would be really fun and interesting to work with children on having a land acknowledgement and not just saying it, but getting them to understand the concept behind what you're trying to do. So what's our intention? It is 1 o'clock. I don't want to keep people because we always try to keep them to an hour. I'm happy to stay on if there are other questions. I will turn it over to Dina to make decisions on what's happening. I'm sure you have announcements before people try to run back to work.
Yes, I just wanted to say thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you to Sabrina for leading us through this conversation. Our FOPL's Truth and Reconciliation document, the one that Sabrina was talking about today, is available on our website if you wanted to refer back to it and bring that back to your boards or co-workers and that kind of thing. So we do have that available up on our website. A recording of today's session as well as the PowerPoints will be made available later on our website as well. So we'll send that information out to the attendees once it's made available. We have other information sessions available for you. If you go on our website under events, our next information session is about artificial intelligence and what our librarians need to know about this kind of confusing, interesting new technology that seems to be invading every aspect of our lives, it seems. So thank you again to Sabrina. And as she said, we can stay on for anyone else who wants to ask questions or further the conversation, but we'll end the formal presentation now.
Janet had a question.
Thank you, Sabrina. So we had a very interesting conversation last week with CEOs in Simcoe County, and we have expanded that out to include any of our First Nations public libraries. And so we were establishing a cataloging committee, and one of the things that came up was subject headings and the fact that the Dewey Decimal System really isn't accurate, and that there really needs to be like an Ontario-wide or Canadian-wide system, that new system that needs to be put in place with that. And we struggle with how to catalog our material appropriately, A, and then B, how do we present that as part of our collection? So is it something, you know, we don't want to send them out, so we don't want to put labels on it. Should we separate the collection? Do we include it in the collection? And we have all these things mulling around in conversations with staff. And I'm just wondering if you can provide some insight with regards to that.
Certainly. NICLA, I'll give another plug to NICLA, National Indigenous Knowledge and Language Alliance, is working on a respectful terminology platform project. And that is exactly working on that piece. So we are working with Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, obviously with a Canadian focus, and working to create those ontologies for how these pieces go in. I know I had, you know, serious issues when I would come in and look at an Indigenous collection, and almost everything was in like 306 under social problems. It's like, oh, come on, like there's got to be more. Or I want to find something on, you know, veterans who were in World War II. And instead of finding it in where it belonged, it was, you know, to the 16th decimal place because it was Indigenous peoples of. So yeah, I am probably going to have duophytes rolling over in their graves, but I have absolutely no problem with saying that it is a placeholder system and we need to update the program. I don't think we throw the baby out with the bathwater, because it works where it works, but we work with the Library of Congress, we work with the people who are doing this, we work with our catalogers to make sure they know how to do this and to do it respectfully and correctly. You know, Indians of North America. I haven't been an Indian in, I don't know, 30 years. I then became an Aboriginal. I then became Indigenous. I'm an Ongohoe woman, and I don't care what you call me at that point, as long as I can find where I fit in the book. And part of the problem is I'm not in the book, right? So we can at least start looking at what are the terms that need to happen and start moving them in there. I also think that we can easily say, if you take out Indigenous from what this book is about, where would it fit in Dewey? Because a lot of times it doesn't fit correctly. So if you are talking, you know, an example is that so much of what I've looked at is either a social problem. Well, I don't want to be a social problem, right? Take off that I'm Indigenous and I'm not a social problem. Now I fit somewhere else. So yeah, I found that when I walked into Six Nations Public Library had, when I started in 2006, had a great Indigenous collection, totally separated. But it was the religious stories were not in where you find the Bible and the Quran. It was in where you found myths and legends. And I said, well, our children are told that this is the creation story. Our children are said that this is Sky Woman. So we recatalogued all the books on Sky Woman and how she came to Earth and how that creation story began. And we moved it to where it fit in the religious component, because it was our creation story. All creation stories fit in the same place. I did have people who wanted to like hunt me down because how dare you touch Dewey, but we have to. It is so imperative that we shouldn't be finding ourselves in the places that are only negative, or our stories about something that really isn't real. We have to be where we fit. We have to be acknowledged, and we have to fit into a search pattern. So I was using the 690 field. I mean, I always was a little questionable on, do I get to change the 650 on the authority? But if you, as Simcoe County, who are sharing a collection and sharing a ILS, make a decision, be damned for everybody else who doesn't like it, right? So you as a group have to say, what are we going to use here? You have reserves, you have their names, you have their real names, not the names maybe that they are referred to, but what is their community called? Put those in. You can be the authority that says it is a 650 field and that we don't need somebody else to approve that.
Great. Thank you so much.
Sorry, I went off on a tangent there. Geraldine.
Hey there, how you doing?
I am good today. I am
Good.
actually sitting in the office of my new job. I've
Oh,
left
nice.
libraries and I have moved on somewhere else, but it is my first day on the job and it happened to be the FOPL series. So I get to, even on day one, I know I'm never getting out.
No,
No, you never leave the
Absolutely
library
not.
world. No.
All right,
Well,
Geraldine.
anyway.
I had a question. So the Brockville Library is just about to post this week a position for a coordinator of decolonization and Indigenous ways. And I'm preparing my media release and everything for it. Are you aware of any other public library that has this position? So far, I've only found university libraries.
I have not. There may be some of like the big, the five bigs that have somebody who is maybe like in an outreach position that has that in their portfolio. I'm only guessing though. But as far as I know, nobody else has said we are going to have an Indigenous position who is going to be a disruptor. So I am so excited to hear that.
Yes. And so then my next part is that the job posting specifically is for people who are accepted by an Indigenous community in Canada. Is there anything else I should do to avoid the whole pre-Indian issue? And
No, I think it's a tough one. I think that when you do your interviews, that it would be a really smart way to include somebody who is going to assist in making sure the interview questions are what you need to be asking, that they're going to be a member of the committee who is going to help with the initial review of applications to shortlist for interviews and then be part of that interview. It will help you feel that you are making the right strides and let the community know that the walk that you want to take is real.
Excellent. Yeah, it's tough because this is very much settler territory, so there isn't a lot in the local community, unfortunately. We're having to go out a bit far, like to Tyanaga and the Mohawks.
Yeah.
Okay.
We travel. We travel though, right? People will do it, even if you're getting somebody who's going to be zooming in just to be able to give you those supports. It's a really key position, and I think that based on it being such an important position and really a groundbreaking concept, that others are going to watch. So it's important for the entire province. So I think that even if you don't have a strong group active in your community, that if you made that known to people, that they would choose to participate.
That's all. I hadn't even thought of that, and really that is absolutely valid, and it's kind of shameful that I hadn't. So yeah, I would totally do that. Yeah.
That's why we're here. We work better in groups. We work better in groups. Wow, any others? Well, Dina knows where to find me, even though it won't be at the same email address. I am never far away. I see Linda Lou. Hello. How are you doing, Linda Lou? I always check to see what color Linda Lou's hair is going to be today. You've had the purple for a while. I love it. All right.
If anyone has any questions afterwards, feel free to email me. I can help point you to resources, or I can take feedback back to our Indigenous Libraries Partnership Working Group, which is what I intend to do with a lot of the questions that I heard here today. Thanks for joining us.